Greetings everyone, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today's video is going to be a quick Q&A about how could the universe be created in 6 days. So starting in the Sephora Torah, in Bereshit, Genesis 1:1 states the following, Bereshit boro Elohim et hashamayim v'et ha'oretz, v'ha'oretz ha'yotho, thohu wavohu, v'choshech al penei thahom, v'ruach Elohim marahafat al penei hamoyim, ويومر إلهيم يهي أور وهي أور ويار إلهيم أث أور كتبوا يبدل إلهيم بين أور وبين حوشخ ويقرأ إلهيم لأور يوم ولحوشخ قر ليلو وهي أعرف وهي باقر يوم حوت. Now the part I want to focus in on for this video is the section here that says وهي أعرف وهي باقر, and then it says يوم حوت. Now, the reason why I'm going to focus in on this is because of the fact that when you look at the Hebrew text, and again, pushing away the English text, the English has no precedent here, it has no say in the matter here. What you find is if you go through all the different days that are mentioned in the Torah, it states something very specific. When it gets to the one I just read, where it says Yom Echad, the best translation for that in English would be day one. But then when it gets to the other days, like Yom Sheni, it calls it in Hebrew, a translation from Hebrew to English would be second day. The next one would be Yom Shlishi, third day. The next one would be Yom Revi'i, the fourth day. The next one would be Yom Hamishi, the fifth day. And then the last two are said to be Yom Hashishi, meaning the sixth day, and then Yom Shiva'i, Hashiva'i, the seventh day. Now, the interesting thing about this is one of the questions that if somebody knows Hebrew and says, okay, well, wait a minute, what is this? Why is this like written out one way in several different ways? Why is it just not say first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, seventh day? Why does it say day one, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, the sixth day, the seventh day? So there's an explanation of this that comes from the different Chachamim, from Chazal, and also from the Pirushim that are on the Torah. So Rashi, for example, explains the following. He says, Yom Achad lefi serer lashon haparasha haya lo lichtov yom rishon, kamo shekatuv b'sha'ar hayomim sheni, shlishi, revi'i. Lama katav echad. לפי שהיה הקדוש ברוך הוא יחיד בעולמו, שלא נבראו המלאכים עד יום שני, כך מפורש בראשית רבה. Gimel Het. Translating this, what this means is that if you go to the very top, Rashi basically explains, he's a commentator on the Torah for those who don't know, that according to the way the language should be, you would expect that, for example, the Torah says that the first day is in Hebrew called Yom Rishon. Yom Rishon means first day. But instead the Torah says day one. So he says like the other days are mentioned second day, third day, fourth day, meaning Yom Sheni is second day, Shlishi, third day, Revi'i, so on and so on. So it's like, why exactly is it written this way? So in the green he explains that, Lafi Shahaya Kadosh Baruch Hu Yachid Be'alomo. שלא נבראו המלאכים עד היום השני, כך מפורש בבראשית רבה. So he explains in the green that at the beginning, in a sense of this whole process of creation, that there was only Hashem, there was nothing else there. That Hashem, is like basically, as we would say in Hebrew, the best way to translate the idea is that there was no concept of time for the Creator, that essentially the Creator of all things exists outside of time, and that there are certain things that weren't created, almost like the physical laws of nature, for example, until the second day. And this is explained in one of the Midrashim on this issue. And this, again, this issue, this particular topic is brought up a lot in writings from the different generations for the last 2,000 years of written Jewish history. This idea that, for example, time in itself is something that the Creator of all things established and created. And specifically the concept of time as we experience it as human beings. And going into this issue, there's a commentator named the Maharal in a book that he wrote, Tiferet Yisrael, Pei Mem. He basically explains the following: מה שהיה השם יתברך פועל העולם בזמן הוא מצד המקבל. So essentially, he's like saying that the idea of time, in a sense, is like a type of Kabbalah, because of the fact that the Creator of all things established time itself. That time is not something that affects the being that created time. All of these things are subject to the will of the Creator, and also our perspective of time, as we'll get into in just a second, is something that has to be even analyzed in terms of how we understand it and how it could be understood on a grander scale. So in a particular writing called the Michtave Eliyahu, Kerech Bet Chilek Sheni, he explains the following. He says, Bereshit Yamei Bereshit Vayamei Ha'olam, and this is from, I think, Daf 151, says ימים אלו של ששת ימי בראשית היו קודם גמר הבריאה, שאז הבחנת הזמן הייתה אחרת. אולם התורה ניתנה לנו לפי הבחנתנו אנו, שבא משה בהורידה לארץ, וזו גדר דיברה תורה כלשון בני אדם. שדיברת לפי הבחנתנו וגשם וגתורה, מקום וזמן שלנו, הוא שכל הגילוי 6,000 השנה כלולים בימי בראשית, שאלו לא חטא אדם הראשון, היה העולם הזה נמשך רק 6 ימים, אך כשחטא והימים נתפרטו ל6,000 שנים. So essentially what he explains in this text is that time is in the particular areas of the Torah that are mentioned, like the 6 days, if you will, is not the same time that we experience now, that it was a whole different concept of time. And that essentially after Adam Rishon, basically, did the Avirah that he did, the Het, as they say. In English people say the sin of Adam, but again, sin is a kind of an English, kind of westernized word that doesn't have the same meaning in Hebrew. That essentially the concept of time changed, and that the time that came after that point is what we experience more in our day and time, more or less. And that this is like, in terms of if we were to like try to like say, well, what was happening before that point, we would be getting into like loads of years, like thousands, millions, things like that. That's the concept that's being brought down here. So essentially, along the same lines, the commentator Safrano in Bereshit Perek Aleph Pasuk Aleph, he says the following: Bereshit, בתחילת הזמן, והוא רגע ראשון בלתי מתחלק, שלא היה זמן קודם לו. So essentially, when he's commentating on the first word of the Torah, when it says Bereshit, essentially he's saying that this is like, the beginning, before time, that there was no concept of time before this point, that time didn't exist. And again, one of the things I was mentioning in the previous point is that the Torah is often written in the language of men, even if the concepts are higher than the way that we think, or different than the way that we think. The Torah has to be written in the language of men, or else you'd have some metaphysical book that nobody would understand except for a small group of people. So continuing in his commentary, he says concerning the word borro, meaning like to create something from nothing, he says asa enu yashnu uvaze lo yupul zaman kalal. So essentially, again, he's repeating this idea that essentially time there's no concept of time during this point, especially the concept of we have time, because again, we determine time based upon how our planet, for example, goes around the sun. This concept didn't exist if there was no sun and there was no planet. And again, if there's no time the way we understand it, that means there's no past, no present, or future. So this is also like, when people ask, well, how can there be a creator that it wasn't created? Well, easy, because of the fact that there was no concept of time, and we understand time to be a created thing. So if there is no past, present, and future, it's understandable that there'd be something that's the source of all things, that has nothing that predates it, nothing that comes after it, that it exists outside of all of these concepts. And being as small as we are in the universe, it seems like a hefty concept until we look and say, okay, well, we're pretty small in the grand scheme of all the reality. Especially if you look at the concept that we have of time and how much time most people think the universe has existed for. So ending off for the Safrano, he says in another part about it hashamoim. So this is the idea that people say in English, for example, the heavens, for example, but the idea of shamoim in Hebrew is kind of a different concept, which he explains here in the blue, and he says, Hine milat shom Torah al makom rohok. וכל סימן הרבים אם כתימת פתח מלעיל יורה על שניים שווים. וכן במילת שמיים תורה על עצם רחוק והיחס אלינו בשני מרחקים שווים מכל צד. So essentially what he's explaining here is the kind of the basis of the word shamayim, which people often say is heavens, but it doesn't mean heavens. Essentially it's from the word sham, meaning like there. So there, of course, is something, it's not here. So essentially, if we were to say, okay, looking at this example at the top of this page, that something happened 13.7 billion years ago. Well, that's one concept of shomayim. It's there, it's not here. It's something that's beyond our grasp, and that's what he's saying here, that essentially what we're talking about when we say the word shomayim, often in this type of Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, we're talking about something that is completely outside of the grasp of humanity. If a human being may only live, like, let's say 100 or 120 years, or something like that, the concept of billions of years is completely out of the grasp of a human being, and then you could say that, well, that's Shemaim, or in English you would say that, well, that's the heavens, because that's something so far outside of the scope that I can even, relate to. A person can say, well, okay, well, from the Earth to the Moon. Well, only a select group of people have been to the Moon, so that means that for most human beings, the Moon is a far concept from us because we can't just like get on a ship, fly to it, and come back. And then you say the outer planets of the solar system, the same thing, that's often a concept that's bigger than ours, especially since some of these planets are even bigger than the Earth. A person can say, well, I want to go study the sun. Well, studying the sun is something that's so far out there in terms of a concept because you can't physically go and experiment on it. You can't physically go and like touch it, stand on it, dig a hole into it. And even lots of things on the planet that we live on are outside of the grasp. So that's one of the things when the Torah, in this part of the Torah, in the beginning of it, it's talking about Shemaim. It's not talking about the sky. It's talking about concepts that are bigger than humanity, that are far out there, and that we don't have any way to directly connect to it as we are. So one of the things that's interesting again in this concept is if you look in Hebrew text, again, especially like ancient Hebrew text from prior to about 500 years ago, going back several thousand years, you have these discussions about like exactly ideas that are now current with modern scientific thinking. So for example, the idea of an expanding universe. One of the things that's mentioned in a book called Tehillim, which is written by David HaMelech, parts of it were from him, and then parts of it were things he recorded from other people who had lived before him. And he mentions the following: in Tehillim Perek Kuf Dalet Bet, that would be in English Psalms 104, and then the Pasuk Bet. So he mentions the following: Adonai Elohei Gadalta Me'od, Gidalta Me'od, Hod Vehodor Lavashet, Ota Or Kel Shalamon, Nota Shemaim Ki Yire'o. So essentially what he's describing here is as if like the creator of all things is expanding Shemaim, meaning expanding out to, that area of reality that's so far away from, human ability to connect to in a certain way. That it's expanding out like almost like a person spreads out a garment. Now, interestingly enough, the commentator Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, in his commentary of Bereshit of Genesis 1:1, he says the following concerning the word Hashemayim. He says, Haito me'en nukuda pechuto migarger chardal, ve'nukuda acheret ha'aretz ve'kol asher aleho. So essentially what he's describing here is that at some point, the entire reality of Shemaim, for example, was almost like in one point, a nikuda in Hebrew's point, like a point almost like the size of a mustard seed. And again, he's, not saying it was exactly a mustard seed, but saying it's almost like it was inside, all it's compacted together in a mustard seed, and then all of a sudden it was expanded outwards, to the current point that it exists in, for example, or expands out from. So if you take all the different ideas that have existed over the last 2,000 years or more amongst Jewish sources, and probably going back even about 3,000, there are different sages or different rabbis over the last several hundred years who've put them together and basically come up with this calculation concerning time and concerning the time of the universe. So this is the steps if you list at least 8 steps that have been kind of put together by different sources that basically say the following: that number one, there are a total of 7 Shmitot cycles. Shemitah is a type of cycle in Hebrew understanding. Each one 7,000 years long, being 49,000 years. And that's from the source called Sephora Torah. Sorry, Hatemuno. And then it was written about the 13th, 14th century CE. And it says, number 2, we are currently in the 7th cycle, making 6 cycles times 7,000 years, being 42,000 years prior to the creation of Adam Rishon. And that's Levanot Sapir, written in the 12th century. That's the information he came to based on his studies of this area. So number 3 is that since these years are prior to Adam Rishon, they must be measured in divine years, meaning like years that kind of go beyond humanity, for example, rather than the earthly years. And that's from Rav Yitzhak Me'ako. And then number 4, a divine day is about 1,000 earthly years, and that's from a midrash. And also number 5, a divine year is therefore 365 and a fourth times 1,000, which is 365,250 earthly years. And then therefore, according to number 6, it would be the universe is about 365,250 times 42,000, which gives us about 15,300,000, so 40. So, sorry, 15 billion, sorry about that, 340,500,000 years, which was approximately about 15 billion years. And this is the time that's claimed by certain cosmologists who say about 8 to 20 billion years, based on the current thinking, of course. And all of this, again, is, different things that have been discussed in Jewish texts, for about 2,000 years. So basically adding them all up together from the different information that has existed, this is the idea. A person could say to themselves, well, this is all a bunch of nonsense. You guys are just doing some like, makeup stuff. How can you still say that 6 days was, like the creation point? Again, it's not 6 human days. And one of the ways to understand that is this concept that exists in science concerning a galactic year. Now, you may ask, well, what exactly is a galactic year? In our particular solar system, we consider time based upon going around the sun. So all the planets in our solar system go around the sun, and each planet has a different concept of day, for example, or time, based upon what it takes for it to go around the sun. Now, the idea is when you get to our galaxy, for example, the Milky Way, the solar system that we're in is a part of the Milky Way and it goes around the center of the Milky Way. So there's an idea in science that says that you have a year that's galactic that, for example, is considered to be almost like a shorter amount of time than ours. But again, if our planet is going around it and that's considered to be a day, essentially this article from Live Science explains it the following. It says humans are used to keeping time by measuring Earth's movement relative to the sun. But while the Earth's trips around its star are noteworthy to life on our planet, or our pale blue dot, that journey is pretty insignificant when compared with the epic voyage that carries the Sun and our entire solar system around the center of the Milky Way. Orbiting the Milky Way just once takes the Sun approximately 220 million or to 230 million Earth years, according to Keith Hawkins, an assistant professor of astronomy at the University of Texas at Austin. And in the highlighted section, in other words, if we were to measure time by the galactic clock, Earth would be about 16 years old in galactic or cosmic years. The Sun would have formed about 20 years ago, and the universe would be just around 60 years old. Now, of course, that's only going by the galaxy. Now, if we were to expand that out even further to something bigger than the galaxy, of course, the galactic clock changes at that point. So this is the concept that essentially time, is a constructed thing. It's a created thing. And of course, how we understand time and how we develop time and how we, decide how time works, of course, is going to be based upon whatever focus we have in terms of, like what our scope of time is. So this is when the Torah talks about 6 days. It's not talking about 6 earthly days because it never defines that in the Hebrew text as the point of the starting point, if you will. And that essentially Jewish sources for the last 2,000, more than 2,000 years have understood it to be that time, as we understand it, is different than time, for example, that comes from a bigger or more galactic or more universal perspective. So that's the idea that essentially it's not 6 days and hours and minutes in the way we understand it, but more of like 6 stages of creation, 6 stages of the reality being built. Um, and this brings us to the next idea that somebody had asked me at one point about the idea of the creator of all things like resting on the seventh day, the Shabbat or the Shabbat. So essentially, to understand this last concept, when you look at the Torah, what it says in the following says, "Vayicholou Hashemayim ha'aretz v'chod tzava'am." So essentially, all of the Shemaim, which again we mentioned before, is this idea of higher, it's almost like if you say in English, a higher reality than our own, or the reality that's beyond what we can experience in a sense or grasp. Essentially, when the Torah talks about ha'aretz, according to Jewish sources going back another 2,000 years, ha'aretz is not like, for example, the land, so it's not talking about the skies and the ground, but more ha'aretz is considered to be all matter. There's a number of Jewish sources from 2,000 years ago that say this and state this. And all of the, things of reality in a sense. And this is probably the better way to like kind of sum this up in an English sense. So in the yellow bracketed area, it says, "Vayachol Elohim b'yom hashvi'i malachto asher also." So it says that, Hashem, you know, um, completed, all of, his creation, like on the seventh day, this Yom B'Yom Shavi, or if you will, the seventh stage of like this reality building. All of the malacha, the type of work that deals with creative process, he like stopped essentially, or it was completed, from what he had done. And in the red it says, "Vayishbot bayom hashvi'i mikol malachto asher asan, v'avorech Elohim et yom hashvi'i, v'kadesh oto ki vo shavat mikol malachto asher boro Elohim na'asot." So essentially, what it says in the red is that after this period of all of this reality building, if you will, being completed, that the creator of all things stopped from that process in a sense and made everything set apart. And essentially being, people say holy, but usually the word set apart is better. So the sections I have here detail that, where in the yellow basically it's describing this section denotes that the Creator completed the work of creation, and that Jewish sources state that this would be like saying that the laws of the physical world were established and set in place. The red areas being that the section denotes that the Creator let the reality that was created go as it is, and thus the creative process was completed, and thus there was no additional laws of reality established. Now, the next area of this is concerning the Shabbat itself, the Shabbat. So it says, Ki sheshet yomim also Adonai et hashemayim v'et haaretz et hayom et kol asher bom in the red. Then it says in the yellow, V'yanoch bayom hashvi'i al ken baruch Adonai et yom hashabbat v'kadeshehu. So this section notes that the Creator established reality in 6 stages or 6 days. And then in the yellow, it denotes that the section that denotes that the Creator ceased from the creative process during the 7th day. This is the concept of that Israelis, and Jews take to imitate the keeping of the Sabbath. So essentially, when Jews are keeping the Shabbat, it's essentially we are in a sense imitating, or if you will, simulating, essentially the work that was done to create the universe, and then the setting in place of the universe. So when we keep the Torah, this is the idea. So that Shabbat wasn't simply just given as like, okay, don't do any work, just go to sleep, and anyone who does work, blah blah blah. The idea is that it essentially it connects a person to the Creator of all things by allowing us to do what we can in our own reality to imitate the Creator of all things. That we work from, like we Jews do. We Jews have a requirement to work, for 6 days, and then on Yom Shabbat, essentially to put away those things and make the Shabbat, set apart from the rest of the week. So this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and I think I kept it down to about 20 minutes, so that's a good thing. So take care. Bye.